Hi there. Welcome back to Tuesday's Tips. I'm Greg Kaiser, and in this weekly feature, I like to bring some tips, some tricks to those of you that use Lightroom, and most of them can be applied to other image editing software. We've been kind of going through some basics over the past few weeks here, and I've decided that I kind of like the idea of just going through these different panels slider by slider to show you how they work. So what we're going to look at today is going to be the exposure and contrast slider. We're still talking about global edits, and I had a shoot very recently where I actually used both of these sliders. And this is not something that I normally do because normally I get the exposure pretty much right in the field, and I like to do contrast in curves more than with the contrast slider, but I had an opportunity that both of these sliders became beneficial with images that I shot. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that today. So we're going to start off by bringing us up to Lightroom, and you should be seeing Lightroom at this point. And this is the first picture that I would like to talk about. And obviously, if you're looking at this, it's probably a little bit bright. That was by design. What I was looking at was an area where I wanted to have a lot of detail in the darker areas because of the shadows, especially up here along the top of the old store here. And if I had exposed it correctly, quote unquote, in the field, I potentially would have lost information there that I wanted to capture. So what I did, and I've used this term before, it's called exposing to the right. And what that means is I will set the exposure as bright as I can in the camera without clipping any of the highlights. And you can see up here in the histogram, I was able to do that. I've got all of my tones here right up to that right-hand side, which is the white. And there's nothing here on the left indicating pure black. So what I've got deep shadows, and I've got bright highlights, but nothing clipping on either side. That's what I wanted to achieve with this, and I knew what I'd be doing would be adjusting the exposure in post. There are a lot of other things that happened, but one of the first things that I did was deal with exposure. We've talked about all these other sliders up around here on the top of the basic tab, but the exposure is just that. It adjusts the overall brightness of the scene, just like changing shutter speed or aperture or ISO in your camera will do. And if you'll look up here in the histogram, there's this area here in the middle that is highlighted. You can kind of see it over here next to this blue hump. This is the area where exposure happens. This is the midtones, and it will adjust that histogram primarily in those midtones. We've got the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks to adjust the other areas of that histogram. But as you see, we have taken it just about as far as we could. If we look up at that arrow, yeah, okay, it won't actually clip, but this, of course, is way too bright to have shot it. Where we're at, this is what the camera captured, and what my intention was to drop the exposure down. And what I ended up doing, and of course each one of these sliders will make its own difference. So throughout the course of the edit, the end result was almost a full stop underexposed from where I was. That's not fixing it in post. That is processing it based on how I planned on shooting it. And I always advocate that. Go out and shoot the picture the way that you want to process it. So I knew I needed to expose the right on this one so that I had that shadow detail. Because now, even though this is really dark up here in the shadow area, I've got plenty of ability to bring that up. And there's plenty of detail there. I don't increase any of the digital noise or anything like that. The overall contrast of the scene worked for me here. And what I ended up with was this version. Of course, there's been a little bit of perspective correction because of the angle the camera was at, but I was able to bring the contrast in where I wanted it, and there's still detail in all these dark areas. I've got the rich colors that I wanted. Everything is how I envisioned this scene. And you see here the exposure down about a full stop. Didn't do anything with the contrast with this one. The other sliders here have been adjusted accordingly. And of course, I've got a lot of local edits done. There was a good bit of editing done on this photo. But it all started from this pretty much overexposed image. And I was able to darken it here and get all of the detail that I wanted. So that's one example of changing the exposure, and it does primarily work those mid-tone areas, as you see up here in the histogram. That's the area that exposure works. There's a little bit of motion on the outside, but those tones are better adjusted through the highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks. The other example that I would like to show is a GMC truck that I shot on the same property, same morning. This one was in the shadows. It was in a partially covered lean-to type enclosure on a barn. I didn't have a lot of light to work with. As you see here, I shot this at f/16. It was a 13-second exposure, just because there was not that much light here. So what happens when you're in a low light situation is contrast is generally going to be lower, because there's not as much difference between shadows and what's lit. Most of this is just bounced light from the wood over here on the side of the barn, a little bit coming in from outside. You see some specular highlights here. That's from the front that was uncovered. But mostly my issue here was it was a very flat image. So what I ended up doing, went through all my different edits and everything, but for this one, I got the exposure right. We're looking at the histogram here. What is clipped down in the darks is here where it's supposed to be black. It's here in these vents that's supposed to be black. There's really nothing clipped except right there on the edges. You see the red right there on the edge of the emblem, and that's just that specular highlight. Don't have a problem with that. So I got this exposed pretty much exactly the way I needed to. It is that perfect bell curve that you just never see in photography. So I'm real happy to see that. But because of that perfect bell curve, I have very little contrast. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to adjust the contrast. And this works with both edges, and it's kind of a hammer of a tool. It's not something that you can really fine tune, but what it does is it will spread tones. Either if we go this way, it reduces it, and you see that bell curve growing in the middle. It's pushing all of these tones closer to the middle of that graph. That's not what I want, because this just makes it more flat. So what we're going to do, we're going to add contrast. And we don't need to do a whole lot. And of course, as we go in and fine tune the contrast throughout, doing other things, texture, clarity, tone curve, all of those things will adjust the contrast. But for right now, I like where we're at with plus 30 because it deepens the blacks here. It brings the brights up a little bit. Now you can see that the arrow up here is showing the clipping. So if we need to see where that is, just go down here to the blacks, hit Alt if you're on a regular IBM computer. If you're on Apple, it's going to be Option, I believe. But you press that down, left click on the mouse, and you see over where the vent is, there's a little bit of clipping, and then under the hood, there's some clipping there. And of course, we will fine tune that, bring the blacks down as I've done in other videos. But the main thing here, and why I wanted to show this, is I don't get to do the contrast slider all that often, but with this one, it was just so flat a scene, I wanted to get a little bit better start. So I increased that contrast to where it started to look like it had more body there. The end result, and I ended up cropping this because I didn't like the fact that the emblem was essentially centered in the image left to right, and I went to a square crop. So this is where we ended up. Contrast ended up at plus 26, but I changed the white and the black points. I dropped the shadows, which intensified the deepness of them, and I raised the highlights, again, adding contrast. There were a lot of different things that I did here, but we went from basically a flat image to one that has a lot of contrast, actually looks like the sunlight was on it, which was kind of what I wanted. I wanted to get this orange to pop against this blue. So I added a lot of different light and that sort of thing. So that is kind of what I wanted to get into today, and it's just simply dealing with exposure and contrast. So I hope you've enjoyed this week's Tuesday's tips. It was a quick one. There's not a lot to exposure and contrast. It's fairly self-explanatory, but those sliders are there to help you out if you need it. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope to see you back here again next week. And don't forget, I do offer mentorships. If you'd like to sign up for a virtual mentorship where we can talk about image editing, that would be fantastic. We can do that online. If you'd like to do some photography mentorship with me in the field and you're around the foothills of North Carolina, let me know. We can get something set up, and I'm very flexible and do try to custom tailor the experience to what your needs are. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next week. Happy shooting.